The challenge was meant to shatter her. Survival prevailed instead. Part 1. The Selection. The news came on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. World-changing things should not happen on Tuesdays. Lyrae Voss was sitting in her small office on the diplomatic station called Threshold of Accord when the message arrived. She was reading trade reports. She was drinking cold coffee. She was thinking about whether she should call her mother back on Earth. Then the door opened, and Admiral Chen walked in with a face that looked like someone had died. "They issued the Crucible," he said. Lyrae put down her coffee. She knew what the Crucible was. Every human diplomat stationed on the threshold knew. It was an old law, buried deep in the rules of the Galactic Concord, the great council of species that governed known space. Any seeded species could challenge another species to a trial. If the challenged species failed, they lost their seat on the council. They lost their voice. They lost their protection. Everything humanity had built in 40 years of careful, patient diplomacy would disappear overnight. Who issued it, she asked, though she already knew. The Vaylith. Of course it was the Vaylith, the tall, scaled, cold-blooded reptilian species that had held power on the Concord for 12,000 years. They had never liked humans. They thought humans were loud and messy and too young to matter. 40 years was nothing to a species that measured its history in ages. "And who did they name?" Lyrae asked. Admiral Chen looked at her for a long time. His eyes were tired and sad and angry all at once. "You," he said. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Lyrae did not understand at first. She was not a soldier. She was not a fighter. She was a linguist, a translator, a woman who spent her days turning alien words into human ones and human words into alien ones. She was good at her job. She was patient and careful, and she noticed small things that other people missed. But she was not the kind of person you sent into a survival trial on a death world. And that, she realized slowly, was exactly the point. The Vaylith High Arbiter, a massive scaled creature named Seskareth, made the formal announcement in front of the full Concord Assembly the next morning. He stood at the great podium in the central hall, surrounded by representatives of 100 species, and he spoke in a voice that was calm and smooth, and absolutely without mercy. The terms were simple. Lyrae Voss would be sent to a planet called Voron Ka. It was a Class 7 death world, which meant it was one of the most dangerous places in known space. She would go alone. She would carry no technology, no weapons, no supplies. She would survive for 30 solar cycles. If she lived, humanity kept its seat. If she died, humanity was done. The hall was quiet after he finished speaking. 100 alien faces looked at the small human woman sitting in the human delegation section. Some looked curious. Some looked bored. A few looked almost sorry. Lyrae kept her face still. She had learned that from years of diplomacy. Never let them see what you feel. Never give them the reaction they want. After the assembly, her human colleagues gathered around her in their quarters. Some were angry, some were scared. A young officer named Park slammed his fist against the wall and said they should refuse, they should fight it, they should do something. But there was nothing to do. The Crucible was legal. Refusing it meant automatic forfeiture. The rules were clear and old and unbreakable. Admiral Chen pulled her aside that evening. He was an old man with white hair and steady hands, and he had spent his whole life trying to earn humanity a place among the stars. "They picked you because they think you will break," he said quietly. "They looked at every human on this station, and they chose the one they thought was weakest, the translator, the quiet one, the woman who reads books and drinks too much coffee." He put his hand on her shoulder. "Prove them wrong, Lyrae." She nodded. She did not trust her voice to speak. That night, Seskareth came to see her. He came alone, which surprised her. He was enormous up close. His scales were dark green, almost black, and his eyes were the color of old gold. He moved slowly and carefully, the way very powerful creatures often do. "I have come to offer you a choice," he said. His voice was low, almost gentle. "You may resign your position before the trial begins. If you do, another representative will be named, and the crucible will proceed with them instead. You do not have to do this." Lorray looked up at him. He was almost 3 times her height. "Why are you offering me this?" she asked. "Because Voron Ka has claimed every species that has ever set foot on it," he said. 39 challengers over 12,000 years. Warriors, predators, beings far stronger and faster and harder to kill than any human. None of them survived. You will die there, Commander Voss, not because you are weak, because the planet is strong. There was something in his voice that she almost believed was kindness. Almost. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "I decline." He studied her for a moment, then he nodded once and left without another word. 3 days later, she stood in the launch bay of the station. They had taken everything from her. Her uniform, her boots, her earpiece, her watch. Everything that connected her to the world she knew. They gave her a thin gray suit made of basic cloth and nothing else. The orbital drop pod was small and cold. She sat inside it, alone, and felt it detach from the station. Through the tiny window, she watched the stars turn as the pod angled toward the planet below. Voron Ka was brown and green and ugly. It looked like a bruise on the face of space. The pod hit atmosphere and shook so hard her teeth rattled. Heat blazed across the tiny window and turned the world orange. She gripped the edges of her seat and breathed. In and out, the way her mother had taught her when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. The pod slammed into the ground, and the door blew open, and the air of Voron Ka hit her like a wall. It was hot and wet, and it smelled like rotting metal and living things. Sounds came from every direction, screaming birds, clicking insects, the deep, low rumble of something very large moving through trees she could not see. She stepped out of the pod on bare feet. The ground was warm and soft, and covered in something that was not quite moss and not quite mud. Above her, the pod's heat shield caught fire as the remains of the orbital shell burned up on re-entry. A streak of white light crossed the darkening sky, and then it was gone. The last piece of her old world, burning to nothing above her. Lorray Voss stood alone on a death world, barefoot and empty-handed, and she listened to the planet breathe around her. 30 days. She had 30 days to do what no being in 12,000 years had ever done. She took a breath of alien air and started walking. The challenge was meant to shatter her. Survival prevailed instead. Part 2. The World That Eats. The first thing Voron Ka taught Lorray was that everything on it wanted her dead. Not out of anger, not out of cruelty. It was simply the way the place worked. The planet ran on hunger, and she was new meat. She learned this on her very first night, when she sat down against a tree to rest and the bark moved. Something flat and wet peeled itself off the trunk and wrapped around her arm. It had no eyes and no mouth, but it squeezed like a fist, and she felt her skin begin to burn. She screamed and tore at it with her other hand, and it came away with a sound like ripping cloth. The skin on her forearm was red and raw and bleeding. She ran. She did not sit against any more trees after that. Water was the first problem. The planet was wet. Moisture hung in the air like a curtain, and collected in pools and streams everywhere she looked. But, on Voron Ka, water was a trap as often as it was a gift. She found a clear pool on the second day, and drank from it, and within an hour she was vomiting so hard she could not stand. Something lived in the water. Something too small to see. It burned through her stomach like fire and left her shaking and weak on the ground for half a day. After that, she watched the animals. She sat still for hours and watched what the small creatures did. The little six-legged things that looked like rats with too many teeth. The flat crawling things that moved through the mud. She watched which pools they drank from and which ones they avoided. She watched which plants they ate and which ones they walked around. She learned to read their fear because their fear could keep her alive. On the third day, she found water she could drink, a stream that ran over a bed of dark red stones. She saw the small creatures drink from it without dying, so she cupped her hands and drank. It tasted like metal and dirt. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Food was harder. She tried the fruit that grew on the low bushes because it looked soft and bright, and her stomach was empty and screaming. The first kind she tried made her tongue go numb for 6 hours. The second kind tasted like soap and made her dizzy. The third kind, small and dark and ugly, tasted like nothing at all, but it stayed down. She ate as many as she could find. The spores came on the fourth day. Voronka was covered in fungal growth. Great towers of pale mushroom-like things that released clouds of tiny particles into the air. She breathed them in without thinking, and by nightfall she was seeing things that were not there. Shapes in the trees, faces in the rocks. She heard her mother calling her name from somewhere in the darkness, and she almost followed the voice before she caught herself. She pressed her back against a boulder and covered her mouth with her hands and waited for the visions to pass. The next morning, she watched the animals again. The small rat things stuffed a certain kind of moss into their nesting holes, and she noticed that they did not seem affected by the spores the way she was. She pulled some of the moss free and held it to her face. It had a bitter, sharp smell. She breathed through it. By midday, the visions had stopped. She tore strips from the bottom of her cloth suit and made a rough mask packed with the moss. It was ugly and uncomfortable, and it worked. This was how Lyrae survived, not by being strong, not by being fast, by watching, by paying attention, by failing and getting hurt, and then failing differently the next time. On the sixth day, she met the jaw. She was walking along a ridge, looking for a place to shelter, when the ground ahead of her exploded. Something huge and armored burst out of the earth in a shower of dirt and stone. It was all mouth, a massive hinged jaw lined with teeth like broken glass, attached to a body that was thick and muscled and built for killing. It was fast, and it was close, and it lunged at her before she had time to think. She fell backward. The jaw snapped shut so close to her face that she felt the wind of it on her skin. She rolled sideways and scrambled to her feet and ran. It chased her. She could hear it behind her, crashing through the undergrowth, and she knew she could not outrun it. But she had been watching. She had been paying attention. She had noticed that the jaw always came from below, always burst upward, always struck at things directly in front of it. It was built to ambush, to charge forward. So instead of running straight, she cut hard to the left, and then threw herself flat behind a fallen log. It ran for another 20 meters before it stopped, confused. It swung its massive head left and right. It could not see her. Its eyes, she realized, were tiny and weak. It hunted by vibration, by the feel of footsteps on the ground. She held her breath and pressed herself into the dirt, and did not move. After a long time, the jaw sank back into the earth and was gone. Lyrae lay there in the dirt, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her heart beating so fast it hurt. She pressed her face into the ground and shook. She did not cry. She was too scared to cry. She found a cave that night. It was small and dark and smelled bad. She did not care. She crawled inside and blocked the entrance with stones and branches. and she slept for the first time in 2 days. When she woke, she scratched a mark on the inside of her arm with a sharp stone. 24 to go. Far away, on the station called Threshold of Accord, 100 species watched through the observation drones that circled Vorun Ka in silent orbit. They had expected the human to die in the first day or two. Most of the previous challengers had. A warrior of the Dren had lasted 4 days. A hunter of the Okali had lasted 11. The record was 16 days, held by a massive armored creature called a Brak. It had died of infection from a wound it could not treat. The human woman was not a warrior. She was not a hunter. She was not armored or clawed or venomous. She had no natural weapons at all. But she was still alive, and the aliens who watched her began to notice something strange. She talked to herself, constantly. She narrated everything she did. She described the plants she saw. She named the creatures. She argued with herself about which direction to walk. She told herself jokes that were not funny and laughed at them anyway. The alien viewers found this confusing. What was the purpose of speaking when no one could hear? The humans in the audience knew. Every single one of them knew. She was keeping herself together. She was holding on to the sound of her own voice like a rope in the dark. It was a small, ordinary, deeply human thing to do. And it was working. On the 10th day, Lyrae stood at the edge of a great canyon, filled with fungal growth that glowed faintly in the fading light. She had walked for hours to reach this spot, because she had noticed something. The predators avoided this area. The spore patterns were different here. The ground vibrated at a different frequency. Something about this place was important. Something she did not yet understand. She stared down into the glowing canyon and felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Recognition. The planet had a rhythm. It had patterns and rules and systems that could be understood. It was not random. It was not chaos. It was a language, and Lyrae Voss was a translator. She could learn to read this world. She scratched day 10 on her arm and looked out at the alien wilderness stretching in every direction. 20 more days. She sat down on the edge of the canyon and began to plan. The challenge was meant to shatter her. Survival prevailed instead. Part 3. The Learning Animal. By the 11th day, Lyrae stopped just surviving and started thinking. She had a cave. She had water. She had food that would not kill her. These things were enough to keep her breathing, but breathing was not the same as living, and living was not the same as winning. If she wanted to last 30 days on Vorun Ka, she needed to stop running and start building. She began with tools. She found a type of stone near the canyon that was hard and dark and broke into sharp edges when she struck it against other rocks. She spent an entire day making a cutting tool. It was rough and ugly, and it cut her hand twice while she was shaping it. But when she was done, she had a blade that could slice through plant stems and scrape bark and dig into soil. It was the first thing she had owned since they dropped her here, and she held it in her hand like it was made of gold. Next came rope. She discovered that certain vines near the geothermal vents were long and flexible, and did not snap when she twisted them. She braided them together the way her grandmother had once shown her with yarn when she was a child. She made 10 meters of cord in an afternoon. It was not strong enough to hold her weight, but it was strong enough to tie branches together. That was enough. She built a real shelter on day 12. Not the desperate huddle of sticks and leaves she had been sleeping in, but an actual structure with walls and a roof, and a raised sleeping platform that kept her off the ground and away from the crawling things that came out at night. She built it near a geothermal vent because the heat kept the worst of the cold away during the long nights, and the sulfur smell seemed to confuse the predators. Then she built traps. She had watched the small rat creatures, the ones she had been following since the beginning, and she understood how they moved. They followed the same paths every day, nose to the ground, always looking down, never looking up. She made simple snares from her vine cord and placed them along these paths. On the first morning, 2 of the traps had caught something. The rat things were bony and tasted terrible, but they were protein, and protein meant energy, and energy meant she could keep going. On the 14th day, something unexpected happened. One of the rat creatures she had not trapped started following her. It was small, about the size of a cat, with 6 legs and flat gray skin and round black eyes that seemed too large for its head. It sat at the edge of her camp and watched her eat. She threw it a scrap of meat. It ate the scrap and then sat down and continued watching. She threw it another scrap the next day. By the 4th day, it was sleeping at the foot of her platform. She called it Brick because it was roughly the shape and color of one. Brick turned out to be useful in ways she had not expected. The creature could feel vibrations in the ground that Liray could not. When the earth trembled before a seismic shift, Brick would freeze, all 6 legs locked stiff, and let out a high, thin whistle. The first time it happened, Liray did not understand. The second time she felt the ground shake 30 seconds after the whistle, and she understood perfectly. Brick was an early warning system. She scratched behind its flat ears and fed it the best scraps, and it followed her everywhere after that. By day 16, Liray had mapped the territories of the 3 biggest predators in her area. The Jaw, the burrowing ambush hunter, a flying thing she called the Shadow, which hunted at night with sound instead of sight, and a slow, massive creature she called the Wall, which moved through the forest like a living boulder, eating everything in its path. Each of them had a territory. Each of them marked the edges of their territory with biological signals. The Jaw left vibration patterns in the soil. The Shadow left scent markers on high branches. The Wall left a chemical trail that killed small plants wherever it walked. Liray learned to read all of these the way she had once learned to read alien languages back on the station. Pattern, context, meaning. It was all translation in the end. She started moving through their territories without being noticed. She watched a mid-level scavenger species, a hunched gray animal, that seemed to pass through all 3 territories unbothered, and she figured out why. The scavenger moved in a specific way. Slow, low to the ground, with frequent pauses. It gave off a scent that the predators had learned to ignore, because the scavenger was not worth hunting. Liray could not copy the scent, but she could copy the movement. She practiced it for hours. Slow, low, pause. Slow, low, pause. When she finally crossed through the Jaw's territory using this method, she passed within 30 meters of the creature itself. It did not even look up. On the observation station, the alien audience was no longer bored. The Ketsori, an insectoid species that operated as a hive mind, issued a formal observation that was broadcast to the full Concord. The human does not fight the ecosystem, they said. She does not overpower it. She inserts herself into it. She becomes part of it. This is something we have not seen before. The statement caused a stir. The Ketsori did not give praise easily. They did not give it at all, really. What they had said was not praise. It was something more unsettling to the other species. It was confusion. The Ketsori, who understood systems better than any species alive, were watching a human woman rearrange a death world around herself, and they did not fully understand how she was doing it. Then, on day 16, the planet fought back. The seismic event hit without warning. Brick did not whistle this time because it was not the kind of tremor he could feel. It was deep, structural. The ground cracked open 200 meters from her camp, and a wall of superheated gas and debris blew sideways through the forest. Her shelter was flattened. Her traps were buried. Her food stores were scattered and destroyed. She was thrown off her feet and slammed into a rock, and when she stood up, blood running from a cut on her head, everything she had built was gone. She stood in the wreckage of her camp, and she screamed. She screamed until her throat was raw and her lungs were empty. She kicked a broken piece of her shelter. She sat down in the dirt, and she cried. For the first time since landing on Vorin Ka, she cried the way a person cries when they are not just hurt, but tired. Tired all the way down to the bone. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she wiped her face with her dirty hands and stood up and started again. She found a new location on higher ground by the end of the day. She built a new shelter, faster this time, because she already knew how. She set new traps along the paths she had already mapped. She rebuilt her water collection system, using the same design, but with better drainage. Everything she had learned was still inside her head. The earthquake could destroy her camp, but it could not destroy what she knew. Back on the station, Admiral Chen was sitting in the observation hall next to a colleague. They had watched the whole thing in silence. The destruction, the screaming, the crying, the rebuilding. She is not enduring it, Chen said quietly. She is colonizing it. By day 17, Li Rei had found the bones. They were in a shallow cave near her new camp, half buried in mineral deposits. Alien bones. Different sizes, different shapes. Some were massive, some were small and delicate, but they were all here, in this place, on this planet. These were the remains of the other challengers, the ones who had come before her, the warriors and predators and hunters who had been sent here by the Crucible and had not come home. She counted them. She could not identify the species. She did not know their names, but she sat with them for a long time, and she touched their bones gently, and she said she was sorry. She said it out loud, even though there was no one to hear. Then she carried the bones outside and buried them properly, one by one, in the soft ground, near a grove of bioluminescent fungi that glowed blue in the fading light. It took her most of the afternoon. When she was done, she sat down near the graves and looked out at the landscape stretching below her. The fungal network that covered the floor of the Great Canyon was pulsing with light, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She had 17 days behind her now, 13 to go. And for the first time on Vorin Ka, Li Rei Voss smiled. H1. The challenge was meant to shatter her. Survival prevailed instead. H2. Part 4. The Breaking Point. The storm came on day 23, and it came to kill. Li Rei had felt it building for 2 days before it hit. The air pressure changed. The animals went quiet. Brick pressed himself flat against the ground and refused to move, his 6 legs locked stiff, his small body trembling in a way she had never seen before. The fungal network in the canyon below went dark, all at once, as if someone had switched off a light. In 13 days on Vorin Ka, Li Rei had never seen the fungi go dark. She prepared as best she could. She reinforced her shelter with extra supports. She moved her food stores to the highest and driest spot she could find. She sealed the entrance with layers of branches and packed mud and moss. She filled every container she had with clean water, and then she sat inside and waited. The storm hit at what she guessed was midnight. It did not start slowly. One moment there was silence. The next, the world outside her shelter became a screaming thing. Wind hit the walls so hard the branches bent inward. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid sheets that pounded the roof like fists. Lightning split the sky in colors she had never seen, not white or blue, but deep red and purple and green. The thunder was not a sound. It was a physical force. It shook the ground and rattled her teeth and made her ears ring. The temperature dropped. On a planet that was usually hot and wet, The storm brought cold that cut through her thin cloth suit like it was not there. She curled into a ball on her sleeping platform and pressed Brick against her chest and shivered. The little creature was warm, at least. Small comfort from a small friend. The storm did not stop. It went on through the night, and into the next day, and into the next night. It went on and on and on, as if the planet had decided that enough was enough, and it was time to end this. On the second day of the storm, her food ran out. She had not stored enough. She had not imagined the storm would last this long. Her stomach cramped and twisted, and she drank water to fill the emptiness. But water was not food, and her body knew the difference. On the third day, her water filtration system collapsed. The rain had undermined the ground beneath it, and the stones she had carefully stacked had shifted and fallen. She tried to fix it, but the wind was too strong to go outside for more than a few seconds. She caught rainwater in her hands, but the rain on Voron Ka during the storm was filled with chemicals that the wind had stripped from the upper atmosphere. It tasted like acid and burned her lips. On the third night, the spore mask failed. The moss inside it had gotten wet and lost its filtering ability. The hallucinogenic spores were everywhere, driven into every crack and crevice by the howling wind. She breathed them in, and the world began to shift. The hallucinations started small. Shadows that moved wrong. Sounds that did not match what she was seeing. The walls of her shelter seemed to breathe in and out like a living thing. She pressed her hands over her eyes and told herself it was not real. It was not real. It was the spores. She knew this. She was a smart woman who understood what was happening to her brain. Knowing did not help. By midnight, the visions were strong. She saw her mother. Her mother was sitting in the corner of the shelter, wearing the blue dress she always wore on Sundays, and she was smiling the way she smiled when Lee was small and sick and needed comfort. Lee reached for her, and her hand passed through empty air, and her mother was gone. He was standing at the entrance of the shelter, and his face was tired and disappointed. "It is over, Lee," he said. "You tried. Nobody blames you. It is over." She shook her head and pressed her hands against her ears, but his voice came from inside her own skull. She saw Seskareth. The Veilith High Arbiter was sitting across from her, his golden eyes calm and patient, and he held out his hand. In it was the resignation document, the one he had offered her before the trial. "Take it," he said. "End this. You have suffered enough." And in the vision, God help her, she reached for it. Her fingers were closing around the paper, when she blinked, and he was gone, and she was holding a handful of wet leaves. She fell to the floor of her shelter. She was burning with fever. She was shaking with cold. She was so hungry that her body had started eating itself. She curled into a ball and pressed her face against the ground, and she whispered the worst thing a person in her situation could whisper. "What is the point?" Because that was the real enemy. Not the predators, not the poison, not the storm. The real enemy was the question that the dark and the cold and the loneliness pressed into your mind like a knife. What is the point of surviving if nobody knows? What is the point of fighting if nothing changes? What is the point of being alive on a planet that does not care whether you live or die? This was the weapon the Veilith had truly designed. Not the death world, the despair. Every species that had come before her had faced this moment. The moment when the body was broken, and the mind was cracked, and the universe was silent, and the only voice left was the one inside your own head, asking why. And every single one of them, all 39, had stopped fighting right here. Lee lay on the floor of her shelter, in the dark, and the cold, and the howling wind, and she felt herself reaching for that same surrender. Then she did something that no previous challenger had ever done. She started talking to the planet. not to herself, not the constant narration she had used to keep her mind working during the earlier days. This was different. She spoke to Voron Ka as if it were a person sitting across from her, as if it could hear her, as if it cared. "Let me tell you about where I come from," she said. Her voice was raw and weak and barely louder than the wind. "There is a planet called Earth. It is small, smaller than you. It has water everywhere, big oceans of it, blue water that goes on forever. And the sunlight there does this thing when it rains. It breaks apart into colors, red and orange and yellow and green and blue and purple, stretched across the sky like a bridge. We call it a rainbow. It does not do anything. It is just light. But it is beautiful." She told the planet about cities, about music, about the sound a crowd makes at a concert when the song they love starts playing, about the way snow looks falling at night under street lamps, about the smell of bread baking in a kitchen on a cold morning, about her mother's hands, which were small and rough and always warm. She told the planet she was afraid. She said it out loud, without shame. "I am afraid that I will die here, and it will not matter. I am afraid that I am not enough. I am afraid that the people who sent me here were right about me." She pressed her hand flat against the ground, against the dirt and stone and living rock of Voron Ka. "But I am not going to stop," she said. "You can do whatever you want to me. I am not going to stop." She fell asleep on the floor with her hands still pressed against the earth. The storm broke on day 27. She woke to silence. Real silence. The wind was gone. The rain was gone. Pale light came through the cracks in her battered shelter. Every muscle in her body screamed when she moved. She crawled to the entrance and pushed the debris aside and looked outside. The world was washed clean. The storm had stripped the trees bare and flattened the undergrowth and turned the landscape into something new. Steam rose from the ground in slow white columns. The air smelled different, fresh, like the planet had taken a breath and let it out. Brick was sitting outside the entrance. He looked up at her with his round black eyes. He was wet and muddy, and his fur was matted flat. He let out a small sound, not the warning whistle, but something softer, something that sounded, if she let herself imagine it, almost like hello. She picked him up and held him against her chest and stood in the pale light and breathed. On the observation deck of Threshold of Accord, no one was speaking. The broadcast had run continuously through the storm. Every species in the Concord had seen the hallucinations, the crying, the talking, the hand pressed against the ground, the refusal. The Kethsori ambassador had gone completely still, his wings folded flat against his body. In their species, this meant the deepest possible expression of respect. 3 separate delegations had formally requested that the trial footage be entered into the Concord's permanent cultural record, regardless of the outcome. Seskareth was not in the observation hall. His second-in-command found him standing alone in a corridor, staring out a viewport at the distant stars. He did not turn around when she approached. He did not speak. On the surface of Voron Ka, Lyrae Voss scratched day 28 on her arm. The marks ran from her wrist to her elbow now, a ladder of small scars climbing her skin. 2 days left. Just 2. She pressed her palm flat against the warm rock of her shelter and closed her eyes. "Almost," she whispered. The challenge was meant to shatter her. Survival prevailed instead. Part 5. Survival Prevailed. Day 29 was quiet in a way that Voron Ka had never been before. Lyrae woke at first light and lay still on her sleeping platform and listened. She could hear the insects clicking in the distance. She could hear the wind moving through the stripped branches of the trees. She could hear Brick breathing at her feet, his small body rising and falling in slow rhythm. But the sounds that had followed her for nearly a month were gone. The distant rumble of the jaw moving underground, the high thin cry of the shadow circling at night, the heavy crash of the wall pushing through the forest, all of it was quiet. She stepped outside and stood in the pale morning light, and looked at the world she had lived in for 29 days. The storm had changed the landscape. New fungal growth was already pushing up through the cleared ground, bright and fresh and glowing faintly even in daylight. New paths had opened through the forest where old trees had fallen. New streams ran where the rain had cut channels in the earth. It was the same planet, but it was different now. Or maybe she was different, and she was seeing it with different eyes. She walked through the forest that morning, and nothing attacked her. Nothing ran from her either. The small scavenger creatures she had once studied and copied watched her pass with flat, calm eyes. A cluster of flying things, bright blue with 4 wings each, circled above her head for a while, and then drifted away. She walked through the edge of the jaw's territory, and the ground did not move. She could feel the creature down there, deep in the earth, a distant vibration through the soles of her bare feet. It knew she was there. It did not come. Her marks were on the trees and the stones and the paths. Her smoke from the fires she used to send false signals through the fungal network had seeped into the soil. She was not a visitor anymore. She was not prey. She was something the ecosystem had absorbed and accepted. A new piece of the pattern. Vorun Ka, in its blind and ancient way, had let her in. She spent the morning doing small things. She checked her traps, though she did not need the food. She repaired a section of her shelter wall that the storm had loosened. She sat by the stream, and washed her face and hands, and looked at her reflection in the water, and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. She was thin. Her cheekbones stood out sharp under her skin. Her hair was matted into thick ropes. Her feet were black and hard with calluses. Her arms were covered in scars, some from the planet, and some from the tally marks she had cut into her own skin. She looked like something that had grown out of this planet, rather than crashed into it. In the afternoon, she sat on the ridge above the Great Canyon and watched the fungal network pulse below her. Brick sat beside her. She did not talk, she did not plan, she did not count the hours remaining. She just sat and breathed and existed in a place that had been designed to make her existence impossible. The air was warm, the light was golden, the planet hummed beneath her like a living thing. For the first time, she thought it was beautiful. Day 30 dawned gray and cool. Lorraine was awake before the light came. She stood outside her shelter and looked up at the sky and waited. She knew the retrieval pod would come. The rules of the crucible said it would. 30 cycles. She had counted every one. She heard it before she saw it. A low rumble in the upper atmosphere, like distant thunder, but smoother, more mechanical. A streak of light appeared in the gray sky, and grew larger and brighter, and she watched it come down through the clouds and through the atmosphere, and the heat shield glowed orange, and then the pod was there, settling on its landing legs 50 meters from her camp. The same kind of pod that had brought her here. The hatch opened and warm light spilled out onto the mud. 2 members of the Concord extraction team stood inside. They were Ketsori, tall insectoid beings in sealed environmental suits. They had been told what to expect. They had seen the broadcasts. But when they saw the woman standing in front of them, barefoot and scarred and 30 pounds lighter than the person who had been dropped here a month ago, they went very still. Lire looked at them. She looked at the pod. She looked back at her camp, at the shelter she had built with her own hands, at the ridge above the canyon, at the forest that had tried to kill her every single day and had failed. She walked to the pod under her own power. She did not stumble. She did not fall. She stepped inside, and the hatch closed behind her, and the pod lifted off the surface of Vorun Ka, and she watched through the small window as the planet shrank below her. The brown and green and ugly face of the world that had tried to shatter her grew smaller and smaller, until it was just a dot against the black. She pressed her hand against the window, and kept it there, until the dot was gone. The full assembly of the Galactic Concord was waiting when the pod docked at threshold of accord. Every delegation, every species, the Great Hall was full in a way it had not been full in years. Not since humanity had first been granted their provisional seat had so many beings gathered in one place. Lyrae was given time to clean herself and change into her uniform. She showered for 20 minutes and watched brown water run off her body and down the drain. She put on her diplomatic uniform and looked in the mirror, and she looked almost like herself again. Almost. Her eyes were different, deeper, older. The eyes of a person who had seen something no one else had seen and could not quite explain what it was. The hall went silent when she entered. 100 species watched her walk to the front. She moved slowly but steadily, her back straight, her face calm. Admiral Chen was standing near the human section, and she saw his eyes were red and wet, and he was smiling so hard it looked like it hurt. Seskareth was waiting at the podium. The Valeth High Arbiter stood at his full height, towering above the assembly, his dark scales gleaming under the hall lights. He looked at Lyrae for a long moment. Then he spoke the ritual words that the Crucible required. The challenged species has endured. Their seat is affirmed. His voice was steady and formal. But then he stopped. The ritual was complete. He was supposed to step back. Instead, he stayed at the podium and looked out at the assembly and then back at Lyrae, and he said something that was not in the script. In 12,000 years, the Valeth Dominion has issued the Crucible of Proving 41 times. 41 species have been tested. Warriors, predators, beings of great strength and power and resilience. He paused. None of them completed the trial. Not one. Until now. The hall was so quiet that Lyrae could hear her own heartbeat. Seskareth stepped back from the podium. He looked at her one more time, and she saw something in his golden eyes that she had never expected to see. Not defeat. Something closer to wonder. Lyrae stepped to the podium. She was small behind it. She had to adjust the microphone downward. 100 species looked at her and waited. She had thought about what to say. During the long, quiet hours of day 29, sitting on the ridge with Brick, she had turned the words over and over in her mind. She had considered triumph. She had considered defiance. She had considered all the things a person might say after doing the impossible. She said none of them. I found the bones of those who came before me, she said. Her voice was steady and clear, and carried through the great hall without effort. They were in a cave near where I made my camp. Different species, different sizes. I do not know their names, but I buried them, every one of them, because they deserved better than what was done to them. She paused. The hall was still. Humanity's seat on this council is not just for us. It is for every species that was broken by a system that was designed to break them. We survived, but survival was never the point. She looked at Seskareth. She looked at the HFY. She looked at all of them. The point is that no one should have to. She formally moved to abolish the Crucible of Proving from Concord law. The motion required a majority vote of seated species. The HFY ambassador seconded it immediately. His wings spread wide in what every species in the hall recognized as their highest gesture of agreement. The vote was called. It passed unanimously. Every delegation, every species, even the Valeth. Seskareth pressed his voting seal to the document without hesitation, and Lyrae saw his hand was steady when he did it. The HFY ambassador then rose and made a second motion. He proposed that humanity's status on the council be elevated from provisional to permanent. He cited the Crucible as evidence of what he called moral and adaptive fitness. And the words meant more coming from a species that had never praised anyone for anything. That vote passed too. The hall erupted, not in cheers. Most of the species present did not cheer, but in sound, in movement, in the 100 different ways 100 different forms of life expressed the same thing. Something had changed. Something old and cruel and accepted had been torn down, and something better had been put in its place. Liray stepped back from the podium, and Admiral Chen was there, and he held her, and she let him, and for a moment she was not a diplomat or a survivor or a symbol. She was just a tired woman who wanted to go home. 2 weeks later, she stood on a beach on Earth. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out in front of her, gray and green and endless. The sand was cool and wet under her bare feet. She had not worn shoes since coming home. Her feet had learned the feeling of ground, and they did not want to let it go. The sunrise was starting. The sky turned from black to deep blue to pale orange, and the light spread across the water like something being poured. Somewhere behind her, her mother was making coffee in the kitchen of the small house where Liray had grown up. She could smell it through the open window. Brick sat beside her on the sand. He had been smuggled aboard the retrieval pod inside her jacket, and no one had tried to stop her. He did not like the beach much. The sand confused his feet, and the ocean noise made his ears twitch. But he sat beside her because she was there, and he had decided a long time ago that where she was, he would be too. Liray watched the sun come up over the water. She felt the wet sand between her toes and the salt air on her face, and she listened to the waves and the gulls and the distant sound of her mother humming in the kitchen. She had survived, and it mattered. The light broke across the water, and the sky turned to color, and Liray Voss, who had been sent to break, stood barefoot at the edge of the sea and watched the dawn.